Mithridates the Great, The Man Who Hated Rome, Part 1. Roughly 2 years ago, I recorded my first documentary about Mithridates the Great, the Poison King of Pontus. But honestly, I didn't really know what I was doing. In fact, the entire video was just me stuttering because I never wrote a script. However, 2 years later, I decided to give it another try and create an awesome documentary that you will genuinely enjoy. In the 1st century BC, a comet, now known as the Star of Sinope, flew through the sky and surpassed all others in that area. The historian Justin, piecing together Pompeius Trogus' history, wrote that, quote, "For 70 days the entire sky seemed to be lit on fire," end quote. Fueled by this very omen, Mithridates would rise to extreme heights of power and become Rome's deadliest enemy. But how? How could one single man commit so many atrocities, halt armies that had rarely ever suffered defeat? How could he withstand the Roman war machine for 40 years and drag Rome into what has been called the Middle Eastern Vietnam? Historians have praised Mithridates' military genius. Toxicologists marveled at his ability to become immune to poison in his creation of the famous Mithridatium. Raising the fist of war in 88 BC, Mithridates led an army of united soldiers from modern Turkey, Greece, Armenia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Russia, Ukraine, Moldova, Hungary, Syria, and even Egypt to face off against the unstoppable Roman Republic. At his height, Mithridates brought Pontus from being a backwater kingdom to the richest and strongest in the Middle East. His ally, Tigran the Great of Armenia, would soon join him, and the two would form a notorious Ponto-Armenian alliance and stand together against Rome. And it all began in a little city called Sinope. As I mentioned before, in 135 BC, the Star of Sinope was soaring through the sky. The same year is when Mithridates was born. He was the son of Laodice and Mithridates V Euargetes. The surname Euargetes means benefactor. Mithridates himself was given the surname of Dionysus. Later in his life, Mithridates would take on the surname of Eupator, noble father. The family that Mithridates was born to consisted of his two sisters, both named Laodice, and his brother Mithridates Crestus, the Good. One of the two, Laodice, would be married to the king of Cappadocia, and the other would become his wife. The fate of his brother will become clear very soon. The kingdom that Mithridates was eventually going to inherit was much different from the other kingdoms in Asia Minor. One of the most notorious ancient peoples lived in the region. The Amazonians, famous horsewomen, lived in the small city of Themyscira. Although they never played a large role in the history of Pontus, they would defend the city in the Third Mithridatic War. Other historical traits that Pontus was known for was the large amount of poison that the region had access to. By poison, I mean poisoned plants and venomous animals. Of course, you had your everyday snakes and lizards, but for some reason, Pontus's wildlife, such as the bees and ducks, were oddly immune to the effects of the local poisons, and they themselves gave off the effects that they inherited. For instance, the Pontic ducks. Their blood was actually deadly because they ate so much hellebore and hemlock. Over time, they simply became immune to the poisons and literally fed them into their bloodstream. Another example would have been the honey that bees produce. The stuff was so potent that during the Third Mithridatic War, the turret folk, more on them later, used it to paralyze 1,000 of Pompey's men. There was also a famous mine in Pontus that sent condemned criminals to it because the toxins in the air were so deadly that they eventually killed you just from breathing them in. So you can see that Mithridates' ancestors easily had their fair share of experience with access to poisons. Pontus basically bred animals that carried it in their bloodstream. Mithridates' father, Mithridates V, had more or less kept the kingdom of Pontus in a stable state. He had increased his friendship with Rome by helping them subdue Aristonicus and his rebels in Asia Minor, and also by helping them in the Third Punic War. He had secured a marriage alliance with Cappadocia, the kingdom just south of Pontus, and maintained a strong presence in the Aegean. The kings of Pontus were famous for always participating in horse-related games on the island of Delos. The kingdom of Pontus, for the most part, was liked all around by the other nations in the area, and even by the Athenians, who had built statues to Pharnaces I and his queen Nisa. By the time Mithridates had turned 15 in the year 120, his father had been poisoned. Justin states that it was by his friends. This really doesn't help us as to who it actually was. But the blame is almost always entirely pointed at his wife, because she was basically the only person that could have done it. Now, Mithridates VI's life had been threatened before. In fact, when he was 10, the nobles had tried to have an untrained horse kill him. Just as a reminder, I'm talking about the Poison King, not his father. But now, by 120 BC, without his father's presence around, he was basically at the mercy of his mother and younger brother, so he decided to leave. For 7 years. 7 years is what Justin tells us, but that is just ridiculous. Mithridates was away in the hinterlands of Pontus for a year or two at the most. By the end of those 2 years, he had learned a lot about the nation's landscape and barbarian tribes that lived in it. He was able to recruit tribes like the Turret folk, or Mosiniokoi for people who want to pronounce that word. This tribe was famous for being the deadliest of all in Pontus. They built large tree houses, lived off of saltfish and chestnuts, and fought with double-sided battle axes. When attackers would walk by their elevated houses, they would simply drop down and kill them. Mithridates must have taken into account the access to defensible locations in his future empire, because, by the end of his life, he had built a total of 70 fortresses. By the way, that's a lot, and these were expensive. Some of them are still hidden to this day. Of course, Mithridates finally went back to his home in Sinope and eradicated everybody, including his mother and brother, and any other nobles that didn't switch over to his side. He was about 18 by this point. With his mother and brother dead, Mithridates decided to marry his sister. I mean, what would you do if your parents weren't around? In all seriousness, though, he did this so he could keep his bloodline pure. The Egyptians and Seleucids did it all the time. And with that, Mithridates the Great began his reign. His first two, of so many that I'm not even going to try and name them, children were Cleopatra and Mithridates the Younger. This dude eventually had like 20 kids or something. I stopped counting after a while. With some kids under his belt, Mithridates made his first move of conquest. He walked his army into Colchis, modern Georgia, and took over the entire region in just a year. He also captured what was referred to as Armenia Minor. It was a small piece of territory between Armenia and Pontus. Around 107 BC, Mithridates' general, Diophantus of Sinope, was able to bring cities such as Olbia, Tyrus, Odessus, Istris, and Apollonia, on the western side of the Black Sea, into his empire. By the next year, the city of the Chersonesus, allied with Pontus, requested aid in the war against Scythia. Now, if you wanted me to go into detail about this war, sorry, but I'm not. It's too confusing and difficult to find any sources on. But it is clear that by the end of 105 BC, Mithridates was master of all of the Black Sea. He had a large fleet, a large army, and most importantly, a lot of money. His fort-building program began with booming success. Now, somewhere when his generals were conquering the regions around the Black Sea and before they returned, he decided to leave his kingdom and explore other parts of Asia. With his best friend, Dorylaeus, at his side, Mithridates traveled towards Phrygia, which Rome had stolen from him while he was away 15 years prior, and Bithynia. His reasons for such an excursion aren't really pinpointable, but it would later aid him in his war against Rome. By the time he got back to Sinope a year later, his sister, Laodice, was pregnant. So he killed her, but kept the child, who later turned out to be Arcathius, one of his favorites. Before we throw ourselves into the long wars with Rome, I am going to go over Mithridates' character for a few minutes here. Mithridates was a notorious gem freak. The guy literally collected gems from as far as Babylon, even sending letters to Zacchaeus, a Jew that lived there. For clarification, Zacchaeus was also a gem freak. Alone in the fortress of Talara, Mithridates had 2,000 Rhodopean agate and onyx plates and pitchers. Pompey himself would later be fascinated by the amount of items he would find there. Apparently, Mithridates was also a lunatic because he imprisoned all of his female children and sisters in towers in Cabiria. Some of these women would actually be imprisoned for their entire lives, so much so that when the Roman general Lucullus eventually found them, Appian reported that it was more of a revival than a capture. Throughout his life, Mithridates would reveal several traits of being a psychopath. He became extremely paranoid and almost schizophrenic. He would murder several of his wives and children, and I'm quite sure he came close to murdering some of his generals. I don't know if it was the side effects of the poison or the dude was generally born with a few loose screws. I think one of the most interesting, yet terrifying, and somewhat worrying parts about Mithridates' life is his toxicological work. The reason I just swapped subjects so quickly is about to become clear. If you combine the torture chambers that Mithridates definitely had in his palaces with his actions towards his children and wives, then you get the traits of a psychopath. What do I mean by torture chambers? Well, Mithridates had a few people in his courtroom famous for torturing people to death using poison. Craetuus, Papias, and the Agarai, a tribe north of the Sea of Azov. All were skilled physicians and toxicologists. These two were so deadly in their field of work that they would later get compared to the Nazi physician Joseph Mengele, otherwise known as the Angel of Death. Craetuus and Papias' torture methods were so gruesome that it was almost impossible to find any evidence that they existed. But I did, and no, I'm not talking about them on YouTube. I would probably be banned if I did so. However, the historian Pliny the Elder talked about how Craetuus and Papias were the first to make treatises about herbalism with colored pictures. But you get the idea. Mithridates' lifestyle was not all castles and rivers. The man was brutal, extremely brutal. Now, on top of being a madman that poisoned people to death, Mithridates was actually an extremely talented sword fighter, runner, Justin states that he became so fast that he could outrun or pursue animals on foot, horseback rider, archer, and chariot driver. One of Mithridates' most talented exploits was being able to drive a chariot with 16 horses. By the way, chariot driving was hard with 4 horses. Try 16. He was a renowned boxer and participated in multiple eating contests around Asia Minor. He would impress the audience by flavoring all of his portions with different types of poisons such as arsenic, nightshade, hellebore, and hemlock. By the end of Mithridates' life, he could speak over 20 different languages, fluently too. Alright, enough pampering about my boy. Let's get back to the war front. Roughly around 95 BC, the guy to the east came to the throne. I'm talking about Tigran the Great. He wanted Mithridates to give him back Armenia Minor. Did he? Of course not. But he did give him his oldest daughter, Cleopatra, and allied himself with the kingdom. Now, I've actually skipped over a lot of stuff that happened before 95 BC, so we need to travel back a few years to 108 BC. The Romans were getting thrashed in Italy by a bunch of shirtless Germans, so what did Mithridates do? He allied with Nicomedes III of Bithynia and partitioned the small country called Paphlagonia that was famous for its horses. In a massive turn of events, Mithridates had Ariarathes killed, leaving his sister to rule alone in Cappadocia. This turned out to be a mistake, because by 103 BC, Nicomedes III was invited to the kingdom by his sister. By this point, the short Ponto-Bithynian alliance ended. Mithridates invaded Cappadocia and forced Nicomedes to leave. In the meantime, he put his nephew, Ariarathes VII, on the throne and installed his general Gordius as a regent. However, his nephew didn't want to be a puppet ruler, so he threw out Gordius and prepared to fight Mithridates. The two lined their armies up and it looked as though a battle might take place. But Mithridates had a trick up his sleeve. He requested a parley with his nephew. Ariarathes knew his father was untrustworthy, so he ordered his guards to pat Mithridates down. When they came close to his groin, Mithridates said, quote, "Watch out, you might find a weapon far different from what you are expecting." End quote. With that part out of the way, Mithridates met his nephew in the middle of the battlefield, and then killed him with a dagger that was tied to his groin. He gave his 8-year-old son, also named Ariarathes, the crown to Cappadocia, while Gordius stayed as regent. At this point, both Nicomedes and Mithridates sent envoys to Rome. The Romans simply told them both to back off and selected a noble named Ariobarzanes to rule in Cappadocia instead. With his plans foiled, Mithridates took a seat back and waited for things to play out. He already attracted a substantial audience from the Roman Senate. Around the year 97 BC is when things get interesting again. Gaius Marius, the famous Roman general, was in Galatia, the small barbarian territory that sits at the center of Asia Minor, fulfilling a vow to a god. However, he requested a meeting with Mithridates. Why or what the point of this was supposed to be is still debated. But when the two did meet, Marius told Mithridates to, quote, either become stronger than Rome or submit to us in silence, end quote. Obviously that part was clear. By 95 BC, Mithridates was back at it again and invited Tigran to invade Cappadocia. Tigran had just finished recapturing the breakaway kingdom called Sophene. The deal was that Tigran would take the loot and captives, but Mithridates would get the land. His reasoning for this was that Rome would see Tigran as the aggressor and not himself. Well, they didn't. In fact, they actually sent over Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Sulla was given 2 legions to clear out the pirates in Cilicia as they were becoming untenable. Once he dealt with them, he marched into Cappadocia and skirmished with Mithridates' general Archelaus. The Pontics fought valiantly and gave Sulla a run for his money, but they were eventually pushed out. Ariobarzanes was reinstalled, and Mithridates was told to get out of both Cappadocia and Paphlagonia. Sulla took one more detour and met with a Parthian diplomat. However, he met with him in the court of Ariobarzanes, basically saying that he was an equal to a puppet king. The diplomat was later killed in Parthia when he returned. A year later, Nicomedes III died, and his son, Nicomedes IV, took over. Mithridates immediately gave his rival, Socrates, the means for fighting off his brother, which he handily did. As that happened, Mithridates invaded Cappadocia again. This time, Rome had no other choice but to move in force. Generals Manius Aquilius, Quintus Oppius, and Gaius Cassius were sent with 2 legions, and the orders to reinstall the puppet kings and raise as many soldiers as possible. The petty proxy war was over, and now the 2 empires were about to meet face to face on the battlefield. With the battle lines drawn, the Kingdom of Pontus and the Roman Republic were about to go to war. But why and how did the war even start in the first place? Nicomedes, the king of Bithynia, was in extreme debt because of his bribes in the Roman Senate. So what did the loot-hungry Roman general Aquilius tell him? To raid the coastline of Pontus. With no choice, Nicomedes marched his entire army as far as Amastris and looted everything. Not a single soldier stood in his way. This was Mithridates' own choice, and it reveals just how eager he was to declare war on Rome. Mithridates had ordered for his fortresses to be evacuated and moved his army further east. This gave him the impression that Mithridates was the victim and Nicomedes was the aggressor. After this raiding session, Mithridates sent his famous orator, Pelopidas, to Bithynia to argue his case as a final chance at peace. The historian Appian recorded the entire session between the Romans and Pelopidas. He was not ignorant that they wanted to bring on war, and that they had incited this attack upon him, but he dissembled in order to procure more and clearer causes for the coming war, for which reason he reminded them of his own and his father's friendship and alliance, in return for which Pelopidas said that Phrygia and Cappadocia had been wrested from him, of which Cappadocia had always belonged to his ancestors and had been left to him by his own father. Phrygia, he continued, was given to him by your own general as a reward for his victory over Aristonicus. Nevertheless, he paid a large sum of money to that same general for it. But now you allow Nicomedes even to close off the mouth of the Black Sea and to overrun the country as far as Amastris. And you see him carrying off vast plunder with impunity. My king was not weak. He was not unprepared to defend himself, but you waited in order that you might be eyewitnesses of these transactions, since you have seen all this. Mithridates, who is your friend and ally, calls upon you as friends and allies, for so the treaty reads, to defend us against the wrongdoing of Nicomedes, or to restrain the wrongdoer. When Pelopidas had finished speaking, the ambassadors of Nicomedes, who were there to answer him, said, Mithridates plotted against Nicomedes long ago and put Socrates on the throne by force and arms. Though Socrates was of a quiet disposition and thought it right that his elder brother should reign, this was the act of Mithridates to Nicomedes, whom you, Romans, had established on the throne of Bithynia, a blow which was evidently aimed as much at you as at us. In like manner, after you had commanded the Asiatic kings not to molest Europe, he seized the greater part of the Chersonesus. Let these acts stand as example of his arrogance, his hostility, his disobedience toward yourselves. Look at his great preparations. He stands in complete readiness, as for a great and predetermined war, not merely with his own army with the great force of allies, Thracians, Scythians, and many other neighboring peoples. He has formed a marriage alliance with Armenia and has sent to Egypt and Syria to make friends with the kings of those countries. He has 300 warships, ships of war, and is still adding to the number. He has sent to Phoenicia and Egypt for naval officers and steersmen. These things that Mithridates is collecting in such vast quantities are not designed for Nicomedes, nay, O Romans, but for you. He is angry with you, because when he had bought Phrygia by a corrupt bargain from one of your generals, you ordered him to give up all of his ill-gotten gains. He is angry on account of Cappadocia, which was given by you to Ariobarzanes. He fears your increasing power. He is making preparations under pretense that they are intended for us, but he means to attack you, if he can. It will be the part of wisdom not to wait till he declares war against you, but to look at his deeds rather than his words, and not give up true and tried friends for a hypocrite who offers you a fictitious name of friendship, nor allow your decision concerning our kingdom to be annulled by one who is equally the foe of both of us. After the ambassadors of Nicomedes had thus spoken, Pelopidas again addressed the Romans assembly, saying that if Nicomedes was complaining by bygones, he accepted the decision of the Romans. But as to present matters which were transpiring under their eyes, the ravaging of Mithridates' territory, the closing of the sea, and carrying away of such vast plunder, there was no need of discussion or adjudication. We call upon you Romans again, he said, either to prevent such outrages, or to assist Mithridates, who is their victim, or at all events to stand by, allow him to defend himself, and not help either party. The words of Pelopidas in the alliance of Mithridates, which was still in force, put them to shame, and they were at a loss for some time what answer to make. Finally, after long thought, they made this artful reply: We would not wish that Mithridates suffer harm at the hands of Nicomedes, nor can we allow war to be made against Nicomedes, because we do not think that it would be in the interest for Rome that he should be weakened. Mithridates, having been denied justice by the Romans in this public manner, sent his son Ariarathes with a large force to seize the kingdom of Cappadocia. Ariarathes speedily overpowered it and drove out Ariobarzanes. Then Pelopidas returned to the Roman generals and said, How patiently King Mithridates bore injury from you when he was derived of Phrygia and Cappadocia. Not long ago you have been told already, O Romans. What injuries Nicomedes inflicted upon him you have seen and have not heeded. And when we appealed to your friendship and alliance, you answered as though we were not the accusers but the accused, saying that it would not be for your interest that harm should come to Nicomedes, as though he were the injured one. You therefore are accountable to the Roman Republic for what has taken place in Cappadocia. Mithridates has done what he has done because you disdained us and mocked us in your answers. He intends to send an emissary to your senate to complain against you. He summons you to defend yourselves there in person in order that you may do nothing in haste, nor begin a war of such magnitude without the decree of Rome itself. You should bear in mind that Mithridates is ruling his ancestral domain, which is 350 kilometers long, and that he has acquired many neighboring nations, the Colchians, a very warlike people, the Greeks bordering on the Black Sea, and the barbarian tribes beyond them. He has allies ready to obey every command: Scythians, Taurians, Bastarnae, Thracians, Sarmatians, and all those who dwell in the region of the Don, the Danube, and the Sea of Azov. Tigran of Armenia is his son-in-law, and the Arsacid king of Parthia is his ally. He has a large number of ships, some in readiness, and others are being built as we speak. The Bithynians were not wrong in what they told you lately about the kings of Egypt and Syria. Not only are these likely to help us if war breaks out, but also your newly acquired provinces of Asia, Greece, and Africa, and a considerable part of Italy itself, which even now rages implacable war against you because it cannot endure your greed. Before you are able to compose the strife, you attack Mithridates and set Nicomedes and Ariobarzanes on him by turns, and you say, forsooth, that if you are our friends and allies, you pretend to be so, and yet you act like our enemies. Come now, if at last the consequences of your act have put you in a better frame of mind, either restrain Nicomedes from injuring your friends and allies, in which case I promise that King Mithridates shall help you to put down the rebellion in Italy, or throw off your deceitful mask of friendship, and let us go to Rome and settle the dispute there. That was the final straw. The First Mithridatic War began in the year of 89 BC. Appian states that Mithridates had 300 warships, 250,000 infantry, and 50,000 cavalry, while the Romans had a total of 176,000 deployed for a three-pronged invasion. These numbers are completely over-exaggerated. However, they do tell us just how prepared the two forces were for this war. Mithridates gave a small army to a general named Diophantus and ordered him to hold the southern front if he ever came under attack. In the meantime, his son Arcathius and generals Neoptolemus and Archelaus would lead a force of about 130 chariots, 30,000 infantry, and 10,000 cavalry toward Bithynia in an attempt to locate the Bithynian army. The Bithynian army totaled 56,000 soldiers, and it was led by Nicomedes himself. The two armies stumbled upon one another. The Battle of the Amnias River began. Neoptolemus attempted to gain control of a rocky hill on the far side of the battlefield. Nicomedes predicted this and sent his own troops to deal with him. Neoptolemus suffered heavy casualties as he retreated. Arcathius rushed his cavalry forward and smashed headfirst into the phalanx of Nicomedes. The charge caught the Bithynians off guard and inflicted heavy casualties on them. As Arcathius withdrew his cavalry and began outflanking the Bithynians, Neoptolemus and Archelaus assaulted the wings of the Bithynian army. Losses began mounting just as the 130 chariots saw their opening. Arcathius' cavalry smashed into the Bithynians in the rear. At the same time, the chariots tore through the front of the phalanx. Men were cut in half, limbs and heads were sent flying, and intestines were dragged across the battlefield. The Bithynian soldiers were aghast at their situation, and their king could do nothing about it. About half of the Bithynian army died that day. The other half retreated. Once Mithridates showed up with the heavy infantry, the battle was already over. The captives were given the option to either join his army or peacefully go home. On top of that, the baggage train had been captured, so any mercenaries that were fighting with Nicomedes also joined the Pontic army. The army actually grew after this battle. After the battle, 100 Sarmatian cavalry found 800 Bithynians camping on a small hill. They ambushed the Bithynians and overwhelmed them despite being outnumbered. These soldiers were given the same option as the others. Mithridates sent Neoptolemus and Nemenes the Armenian forward with a large part of his army to try and catch Aquilius. That is exactly what they did. At the Battle of the Protopacium Fortress, over 10,000 Romans were slain and their camp was captured. These resounding battles had opened up all of Asia for conquest. The best part of this is the armies under Oppius and Cassius disbanded on the spot. Over 80,000 men simply dropped their weapons and left. This reveals just how hated the Romans in Asia were. Within the next year would see Mithridates capture Oppius, kill Aquilius by pouring gold down his throat, and send any enemy soldiers all the way back to Italy. By the year 88 BC, all of Asia Minor was his, and the large Roman army that was expecting to counterattack, well, that never came. Rome wasn't only losing in Asia, they were already defeated at home. No, I don't actually mean they were literally defeated. I'm just over-exaggerating what happened. But as a Roman citizen, things were looking grim. The popular Roman civil war was raging in Italy, and their armies were simply being smashed. They lost all of their soldiers in Asia Minor, and now in Italy their troops were being slaughtered by the Italian rebels. But we aren't talking about the Italian rebels, we're talking about Mithridates. What was his next move? His next move was to attack the Aegean. By the way, I know that you're itching for me to talk about the massacre of 88 BC. Don't worry, I will. Archelaus was given the task of making allies by, quote, force or persuasion, in the Aegean, end quote. He led about 10,000 soldiers, mainly Galatians, and a small fleet with pirate allies. They sacked the city of Delos, ending the island's slave trading prosperity. With the surrounding islands secured and Asia pacified, Mithridates did something that would not only shake the ground he stood on, make the Romans shudder in fear, but it would also damage his self-image, or, in my case, it would only make him look like more of a hero. What Mithridates does next has gone down in history as extremely controversial. Well, what did he do? He killed them. All of them. Every single Roman citizen living in Asia Minor was killed, without hesitation. The number added up to about 100,000. But why, and for what reason? These were innocent civilians pinned between two nations at war. Why were they suddenly included and put at the forefront of it? The answer is simple. Mithridates had no other choice. He needed to get rid of the citizens, and he needed his citizens, aka the Asians living in his empire, to prove themselves. So there was no better way to do it than allow the citizens free rein to kill any Italian they wanted. The slaves were spared and joined the army, but the citizens were murdered by any means necessary. The Italians were shot by arrows as they clung to their gods, praying for salvation. In some cities, they would drown the children first, then kill the men and women. Even when the Italians were literally hanging from the temple of Asclepius, the god of medicine, they were killed. In this area of the world, that was seen as a crime, but on the day of 88 BC, it was seen as a heroic act of freedom and revolution. The citizens that were living under the rule of Mithridates were now tied to him forever. The genocide of 88 BC put blood on everyone's hands, and no mercy was expected from the Romans. Mithridates made his message clear. This was a war to the death, and he was taking everyone he could with him. In the wake of the killings, Roman statues were toppled and destroyed. The statues that were originally standing were now covered in blood. The man who hated Rome so much just played his greatest card. Before the killings of 88 BC, a noble from Athens named Athenion met with Mithridates and requested that he attack Greece and liberate Athens. The democratic city wanted its democracy back. Mithridates, now at his height, agreed. Archelaus would lead his small army into the old city and liberate all of Greece. At the same time, General Mithridates attacked the island of Sciathos, and Arcathius and Taxiles with 60,000 troops and 90 scythed chariots marched overland into Europe towards Macedon. Mithridates had plans for himself. Within the same year, the events are hopelessly confused. Mithridates married his famous wife, Monime. They would have one daughter together named Athenias. Monime became the second queen of Pontus. However, the following 2 years would see Mithridates become dissatisfied with her despite him at first being captivated by her beauty. That same year, Mithridates ordered his 300 warships, whose numbers were bolstered by pirates and Greek sailors that defected from the Roman side, to meet him on the coast of Asia. He was sailing towards Rhodes. The entire siege of Rhodes turned out to be a debacle. Mithridates lost several small skirmishes on the island, and he turned out to be a terrible fleet commander. In terms of actual combat inside of the city, every Pontic attack ended in disaster. About the only thing that happened that was important was Mithridates' flagship getting rammed by his allies from Chios. From that day onward, wrote Appian, Mithridates conceived a hatred for all Chians. What happens next is genuinely weird. Mithridates left Rhodes after his failure and besieged the coastal city of Patara. He began cutting down the sacred grove dedicated to Latona. However, he was warned in a dream not to do so. So, to appease the god, Mithridates decided to sacrifice a virgin. Human sacrifices weren't really anything new. The Carthaginians did them all the time. However, just as he was about to kill her, she bursted out in laughter. Mithridates was so terrified that he let the girl live. As Mithridates retired to his palace in Pergamon, he set out to get money, troops, and armament for his soldiers in Greece. Speaking of Greece, there have been some new developments. Archelaus was able to secure all of the Greek mainland as far as Thessaly. Neoptolemus captured the strategic island of Euboea, and Arcathius and Taxiles took the city of Amphipolis in Macedon. So far, the entire campaign had been a success. Bruttius was the only Roman in the area with some forces. He quickly went south and clashed with Mithridates near Sciathos. He was able to force him to retreat and attack the island. He crucified the slaves and cut off the hands of the freemen, allowing them to live a handless life. After this, he moved further south into Boeotia and for 3 days skirmished with Archelaus and Aristion. The Athenian commander, by this point, the reign of Pontic supremacy in Greece was about to be put up to the challenge. Sulla had just left Italy and was now on his way with 5 Roman legions. Back in Pergamon, Mithridates was celebrating all of his success by having a giant statue of Nike, the goddess of victory, place a crown on his head in the theater of Pergamon, which held 10,000 people. The problem was that the statue was being carried on pulleys and levers. As the statue grew closer to him, it crashed and broke. The crown shattered on the ground. The paranoid Poison King suddenly didn't like the position he was in, and the Magi didn't help either. However, if one thing helped Mithridates calm his paranoid nerves down, it was the Halley's Comet in 87 BC. The comet could have relieved any pressure on Mithridates' back. Back in Greece, the epic siege of Athens was underway. From the year 87 to 86 BC, Archelaus would put up a strong defense in his stronghold of Piraeus. For the entire siege, Archelaus kept up attacks on the Roman camp. Mithridates would supply him through the port, and Athens would eventually starve. Athens fell and was sacked so badly that the amount of death and destruction finally forced Sulla to stop his soldiers as his stomach started to churn. Filled with rage and anger, Sulla attacked Piraeus with everything that he had. Archelaus was astounded as Sulla's army threw everything they had at the walls of Piraeus. Archelaus's men fought valiantly, but simply couldn't resist anymore. They finally gave in and burned the port as they retreated. The year-long siege was over. Archelaus sailed away and joined the main army in Thessaly. When he arrived, he found out that Arcathius had died from a disease. However, despite the loss of their commander and Mithridates' son, the army counted 60,000 strong with 90 chariots, and it was ready for battle. Sulla, after sending his sub-commander Lucullus on a mission to acquire ships, marched north and prepared to do battle with the Pontic army. However, when they met in Phocis, the Roman army was so terrified that Sulla forced them to dig trenches and fortify their encampment to keep them distracted before the battle. After 3 days, Archelaus moved his army south and deployed in Chaeronea, the same place where Philip II of Macedon won his battle against the Greeks. Archelaus could not have intended to fight here. He had superior numbers, yet the exact place he deployed completely threw off his advantage. There wasn't even enough room to use his chariots. Once Sulla heard of this, he immediately marched south and prepared to force Archelaus into a fight. The Battle of Chaeronea begins as follows. Archelaus had deployed a small unit of soldiers on a nearby mountain to keep one of the local cities under siege while the main army camped between two mountains and a river. Sulla deployed Murena on top of a cliff above the mountain garrison, while his main army deployed with cavalry on the left, infantry in the center, a unit of reserves in the rear, and Sulla himself deployed behind everything so he could watch the battle. On the Pontic side, Archelaus had chariots in the front, skirmishers, archers, slingers, and peltists behind, and the main body of pikemen behind them. Archelaus deployed himself with the cavalry on the far right, and Taxiles behind him with the brazen shields. A unit of mercenaries was deployed on the left. The battle began when soldiers started running out in front of Archelaus' army. Murena attacked the encampment on the mountain and killed about 3,000 soldiers. As Murena was struggling to reform, Archelaus charged with his cavalry. Hortensius, a sub-commander, noticed this and moved his reserves in front of his cavalry. Archelaus turned the horses and charged head-on into the infantry. A fierce battle began. Finally, in the center the chariots charged. Yet, the Romans were trained for this and moved out of the way. They killed the chariot drivers easily. Archelaus retreated his cavalry and made a beeline to the other side of the battlefield while the phalanx engaged in the middle. Taxiles now moved his brazen shields into the Roman infantry in front of him. Archelaus was given a shocking surprise when Sulla showed up right in front of him and crashed into his cavalry. Once the Pontic horse was off of the field, the infantry soon followed. The battle was over. Sulla had won. The Pontic side lost everything except for 10,000 troops, while Sulla claims to have lost only 20 men. However, this number is way too small. He would have had to at least have a few hundred wounded soldiers. Whatever the case was, one thing was for sure. Pontus had lost a terrible battle. People often overlook the importance of this battle. For one, it was Mithridates' first loss, and it was a potent one for the entire army of veterans. Veterans who had never lost a battle before. One does not simply flick his fingers and raise another army. Or do they? Because that's exactly what Mithridates did. When he heard of the defeat, he didn't sit in his court and pout about it. He raised 80,000 more highly motivated soldiers led by his best friend Dorylaeus. By this point, the Senate in Rome declared Sulla to be an outlaw and sent a second Roman army to Greece under the command of Flaccus. Flaccus marched past Sulla and ended up getting killed by his officer Fimbria in a coup. We'll follow them later. In Greece, once Dorylaeus had arrived, he merged his army with the remaining 10,000 soldiers for a grand total of 90,000 men. Archelaus and Dorylaeus marched toward the Roman army in Greece. For a few weeks, Archelaus danced around Sulla and refused to engage in battle. He simply ran circles around the Roman army, making its frustrated commander even more frustrated. Once Archelaus decided that he was ready to fight Sulla again, he met with him near the field on Orchomenus. Sulla deployed his small army right in front of a mountain, a significant meaning. Sulla was basically telling his army, we were either going to win here or die trying. Sulla started the first day by digging trenches in an attempt to nullify the Pontic superior cavalry. Archelaus and Dorylaeus responded with a cavalry attack. The Romans dropped their weapons and fled, running back to their camp as the Pontic horses cut them down. Sulla personally joined in the battle. He grabbed a standard and shouted, Orchomenus, remember the name. I am prepared to fight and die here. When people ask you where you turned and left your general, tell them it was at Orchomenus. The Roman infantry finally turned around to confront the cavalry. This is where Archelaus' son, Diogenes, died fighting. Once the Pontic cavalry was stationary, it was all over. All the Roman infantry had to do was hack away. The cavalry quickly retreated and pulled back to the flanks. The Pontic archers were caught off guard and had to use fistfuls of arrows as swords. With an ever-pressing attack, the archers retreated and were replaced by the Pontic chariots who got killed by javelins. Some survived and ran backwards into their own infantry. By the end of the first day, 15,000 Pontic soldiers lay dead on the field. The next day, the Romans assaulted the camp and killed the remaining Pontic soldiers as they bitterly fought to the end. Archelaus and Dorylaeus escaped after hiding in the nearby swamp for 2 days. Pontic hegemony in Greece ended that day. Mithridates was now on the back foot. However, my boy wasn't ready to give up yet. He requested for Archelaus to get the best possible peace terms. Immediately, towns started to revolt. Mithridates responded with fury. He enslaved the entire city of Chios. Taking a beautiful girl from the city named Berenike, bringer of victory, he married her. His general, Zenobius, attempted to do the same in Ephesus. However, the city was prepared to defend itself and killed Mithridates' general. In other cases, Mithridates killed 1,500 people in Pergamon. In Galatia, Mithridates invited the tetrarchs who tried to kill him to a banquet. However, he was the one who killed them, except for a few who escaped and threw out the satrap Eumachus. Mithridates lost control over most of the coastal cities and even the entire country of Galatia. And then another problem arose. Fimbria was on his way toward Pergamon. He had been sacking cities and enriching himself the entire time. Given the situation, the best possible thing for Mithridates to do was run to the city of Pytine and wait for Neoptolemus to pick him up with his fleet. However, his son, Mithridates the Younger, was given an army to attempt to stop Fimbria. The battle went badly and Mithridates' son was defeated. However, it wasn't the Pontic fleet that arrived, it was the Roman one. Surrounded on land and sea, it looked as though Mithridates might be captured. However, the untamable king had a trick up his sleeve. After receiving recent news that Archelaus had gotten a treaty with Sulla, Mithridates used this to ask Lucullus for a free pass to the city of Dardanus so he could sign the treaty. Lucullus allowed him to leave. Although Mithridates didn't actually want to sign the treaty, he was fully prepared to make his case as best as possible. He brought an army of 80,000 soldiers, fully equipped with a speech in hand. Here are the speeches recorded by Appian. Mithridates began by discoursing of his own and his father's relationship and alliance with the Romans. Then he accused the Roman ambassadors, committeemen, and generals of doing him injuries by putting Ariobarzanes on the throne of Cappadocia, depriving him of Phrygia, and allowing Nicomedes to wrong him. And all of this, he said, they did for money, taking it from me and from them by turns. For there is nothing of which most of you are so liable to accusations, O Romans, as the love of money. When war had broken out through the acts of your generals, all that I did was in self-defense, and was the result of necessity rather than of intention. Sulla replied, Although you called us here, he said, for a different purpose, namely to accept our terms of peace, I shall not refuse to speak briefly for those matters. I restored Ariobarzanes to the throne of Cappadocia by a decree of the Senate when I was governor in Cilicia, and you obeyed the decree. You ought to have opposed it and given your reasons then, or forever after held your peace. Manius gave Phrygia to you for a bribe, which was a crime on the part of both of you. By that very fact of your getting it by bribery, you confess that you had no right to it. Manius was tried at Rome for other acts that he had done for money, and the Senate annulled them all. For this reason they decided not that Phrygia, which had been given to you wrongfully, should be made tributary to Rome, but should be free, We who had taken it by war did not think best to govern it, by what right could you hold it? Nicomedes charges that you sent against him an assassin named Alexander, and then Socrates Chrestus, a rival claimant of the kingdom, and that it was to avenge these wrongs that he invaded your territory. However, if he wronged you, you ought to have sent an emissary to Rome and waited for an answer. But although you took swift vengeance on Nicomedes, why did you attack Ariobarzanes, who had not harmed you? When you drove him out of his kingdom, you imposed upon the Romans, who were there, the necessity of putting him back. By preventing them from doing so, you brought on the war. You had mediated war a long time, because you hoped to rule the whole world if you could conquer the Romans. And the reasons you tell of were mere pretexts to cover your real intent. The proof of this is that you, although yet not at war with any nation, sought the alliance of the Thracians, Sarmatians, and Scythians, sought aid from neighboring kings, built a navy and enlisted pilots and helmsmen. The time you chose convicts you of treachery most of all. When you heard that Italy had revolted from us, you seized the occasion when we were occupied to fall upon Ariobarzanes, Nicomedes, Galatia and Paphlagonia, and finally upon our Asiatic province. When you had taken them, you committed all sorts of outrages on the cities, appointing slaves and debtors to rule some of them, and freeing slaves and canceling debts in others. In the Greek cities, you destroyed 1,500 men on false accusations. You brought the tetrarchs of Galatia together at a banquet and slew them. You butchered or drowned all the residents of Italy. You butchered or drowned all the residents of Italian blood in one day, including mothers and babies, not sparing even those who had fled to the temples. What cruelty, what impiety, what boundless hate do you exhibit towards us? After you had confiscated the property of all the victims, you crossed over into Europe with your great armies. Although we had forbidden the invasion of Europe to all the kings of Asia, you overran our province of Macedonia, and deprived the Greeks of their freedom. Nor did you begin to repent and tell Archelaus to intercede for you until I had recovered Macedonia and delivered Greece from your grasp, and destroyed 160,000 of your soldiers, and taken your camps with all their belongings. I am astonished that you should now seek to justify the acts of which you asked pardon through Archelaus. If you feared me at a distance, do you think I have come into your neighborhood to have a debate with you? The time for that passed by when you took up arms against us, and we vigorously repelled your assaults and repelled them to the end. While Sulla was still speaking with vehemence, the king yielded to his fears and consented to the terms that had been offered through Archelaus. He delivered up the ships and everything else that had been required, went back to his paternal kingdom of Pontus as his sole possession, and thus the first war between Mithridates and Rome came to an end. And with that, the two kissed each other on the cheek, a killer's kiss. The first Mithridatic war was over, and it was bloody. I decided, based simply on my own interest, to attempt to add the death toll of all destroyed armies and killed citizens. The number I got was staggering. Through all of the killings and defeated armies and massacres, the losses of dead civilians added up to 400,000. For a war that lasted only 4 years, 400 human lives gone is absolutely unbelievable. This alone reveals the brutality of the Mithridatic War and the effect it had on the citizens living in Asia. Mithridates was knocked down but far from beaten. He had to cede all captured territory prior to the war with Rome. He gave Oppius back to Sulla and withdrew his armies and fleet back to Pontus. The first Mithridatic War was over, and several things were pointed out. The Hellenistic style of fighting simply didn't work anymore. Although Mithridates' men fought valiantly and with zeal, they simply stood no chance against the disciplined Roman army. Second, if Mithridates wanted to beat Rome, he had to be Roman. If Romans were good at one thing, that was killing. So why not just do what they did? Mithridates planned on making his entire army a copied version of Rome's. And finally, one more thing that was definitely on everyone's mind. Archelaus was going to defect sooner or later. And with that, I will end the first part of this here and begin writing the second part of this documentary. Thank you all for listening to the first part of Mithridates the Great, the man who hated Rome.